The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Red Pine Tavern, where Rose wiped down the weathered wooden bar for the 100th time that day. At 35, she'd mastered the art of being invisible while keeping an eye on everything. 6 months into this job, she'd earned a reputation for running the cleanest bar in 3 counties, though none of her regulars knew why she was so good at maintaining order. The regulars liked her well enough. She poured generous drinks, remembered their usual orders, and kept to herself. What they didn't know was that Rose wasn't her real name, and that 5 years ago, she'd been known by a different name in a different state, where she'd run with one of the most notorious outlaw crews in the Southwest. The bell above the door chimed as 3 men stumbled in, already deep in their cups from whatever dive they'd visited before. Rose's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her cleaning rag as she assessed them with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years sizing up potential threats. The largest one, sporting a leather vest and a week's worth of stubble, led the pack. His companions weren't much better, one rail-thin with nervous eyes, the other built like a barrel with hands like sledgehammers. "Well, ain't this a nice little setup?" the leader announced, too loud for the quiet evening hour. The handful of regulars nursing their beers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Rose had seen his type before, men who confused intimidation with respect, who thought their size gave them the right to whatever they wanted. "Evening, gentlemen," Rose said evenly, her voice carrying the slight drawl she'd cultivated to fit in around these parts. "What can I get you?" The leader leaned across the bar, invading her space with the smell of cheap whiskey and cheaper cologne. "Sweetheart, you can get me whatever you're serving." His friends guffawed as if he'd said something clever. Rose kept her expression neutral as she reached for a glass. 5 years ago, she would have already had her hand on the gun she'd kept strapped under her jacket. But she'd left that life behind when things went south with the crew. She'd watched too many good people die in a shootout that should never have happened, all because someone couldn't keep their cool. "We serve drinks here," she said firmly. "And we serve them to folks who can behave themselves." The thin one slapped the bar. "Hear that, boys? Ladies got rules." His mock-serious tone carried an edge that made the few remaining customers gather their things quietly. Rose noticed old Joe, a retired rancher who'd been coming here since before she started, catch her eye from his corner seat. He was reaching for his cane, ready to intervene despite his bad hip. She gave him the slightest shake of her head. She'd handled worse than these 3, and she'd do it without anyone getting hurt if she could help it. The leader's smile turned ugly. "Rules are made to be broken, ain't they, boys?" He reached across the bar, aiming to grab Rose's wrist. It was the kind of move she'd seen 1,000 times before, the kind that had once ended with broken fingers and spilled blood. But Rose wasn't that person anymore. She'd built a new life here, brick by brick, day by day. She had something to lose now, not just this job, but the peace she'd found in this small town where nobody knew her past. As his hand came toward her, memories flashed through her mind, the sound of gunfire echoing off canyon walls, the smell of gunpowder mixing with desert dust, the weight of gold bars in saddlebags. She remembered the last words her old crew leader had said to her before everything went wrong: "Sometimes the smartest fight is the one you don't start." The bell above the door chimed again, and Rose allowed herself a small smile. She knew without looking that Sheriff Thompson had just walked in for his usual evening coffee. The timing couldn't have been better if she'd planned it. But these 3 weren't done yet, and Rose knew the night was far from over. They were the kind of trouble that didn't go away easily, the kind that could destroy everything she'd built here if she wasn't careful. And being careful meant handling this situation in a way that wouldn't raise questions about who she really was or what she was capable of. The leader's hand hung in the air between them, and in that moment, Rose had to make a choice, one that would either keep her peaceful new life intact or risk bringing her violent past crashing back into the present. Sheriff Thompson's heavy boots scraped against the wooden floor as he made his way to his usual spot at the end of the bar. The sound was enough to make the leader withdraw his hand, though the smirk never left his face. Rose could read the calculation in his eyes. This was just a temporary setback in whatever game he thought he was playing. "Evening, Rose," the sheriff said, settling onto his stool. He didn't look directly at the three troublemakers, but Rose knew he was taking in every detail. Thompson wasn't the kind of lawman who made a show of his authority. In the months she'd known him, she'd learned he preferred to handle things quietly, which suited her just fine. "Your usual coffee, Sheriff?" Rose asked, already reaching for the pot she kept brewing fresh. The familiar routine helped steady her nerves, though her mind was racing through contingency plans. The moves she would have made in her past life wouldn't work here. She couldn't risk exposing who she really was. "Please and thank you," Thompson replied, then added casually, "Mighty interesting weather we're having. Heard there might be trouble brewing up north." It was his way of asking if she needed help. Rose gave a slight shake of her head as she poured his coffee. She'd learned to handle men like these three long before she'd ever joined up with an outlaw crew. Back then, she'd been a teenage runaway working in a rougher bar than this, learning the hard way how to handle trouble before it turned violent. The three men had moved to a table in the corner, heads bent together in whispered conversation. Their leader kept shooting glances her way, his expression growing darker with each look. Rose recognized the wounded pride in his posture. Men like him didn't take kindly to being thwarted, even temporarily. As she served drinks to her remaining customers, Rose's mind drifted back to the last big job she'd pulled with her old crew. It had been supposed to be simple, hit a bank transport while it was stopped in a small town, similar to this one. But things had gone wrong from the start. Someone had tipped off the law, and what should have been a clean getaway turned into a bloodbath. She still remembered the weight of the money bag in her hands as she'd made the choice that would haunt her, choosing to help a wounded deputy instead of following the crew. By the time she'd finished bandaging him up and hiding him from her trigger-happy partners, the window for escape had nearly closed. She'd barely made it out herself, and she'd left the money behind. The memory made her current situation feel almost mundane in comparison. But she knew better than to underestimate mundane threats. Sometimes the most dangerous situations started with something as simple as wounded pride and too much alcohol. Old Joe caught her eye again as she passed his table. "Think I might stick around a while longer," he said quietly. "Night like this, a lady shouldn't have to close up alone." Rose felt a surge of gratitude for these people who'd accepted her into their community without asking too many questions. "I appreciate that, Joe, but I can handle closing time. You should get home to that granddaughter of yours." The bell above the door chimed again, and Rose's heart sank as four more men walked in. From their unsteady gait and red faces, they'd been drinking heavily too. Worse, from the way they immediately gravitated toward the troublemakers' table, it was clear they were all part of the same group. Sheriff Thompson set his coffee cup down with a deliberate clink. "Quite a crowd for a Tuesday," he observed. His hand wasn't anywhere near his gun, but Rose knew he could draw faster than anyone she'd ever seen, except maybe her old crew's sharpshooter. The 7 men at the corner table were getting louder now, their laughter carrying an edge that set Rose's teeth on edge. She'd heard that kind of laughter before, usually right before things turned ugly. In her previous life, she'd have already had 3 different weapons stashed within easy reach and an escape route planned. But she wasn't that person anymore. She'd spent 5 years building this new identity, carefully constructing a life where violence wasn't the answer to every problem. She'd learned to defuse situations with a well-timed word or a strategic show of backbone. Most of the time, it worked. Still, as she watched the men in the corner growing more boisterous, she couldn't help but remember the lessons her old crew leader had taught her. "The trick," he'd said, "isn't winning the fight. It's controlling where and when it happens." Rose glanced at the clock on the wall. In just over an hour, she'd have to announce last call. That's when things would get dicey. These men weren't going to leave quietly, and she knew they'd been waiting for the sheriff to finish his coffee and head out, as he always did around this time. What they didn't know was that Rose had survived worse odds than this. She'd outmaneuvered professional killers, dodged federal marshals, and once talked her way out of a Mexican prison. The question wasn't whether she could handle these drunken troublemakers, it was whether she could do it without revealing the skills that no simple barmaid should possess. As she wiped down the bar for what felt like the 1000th time that night, Rose began to formulate a plan. She'd need to be careful, strategic, find a way to handle this situation that wouldn't raise any questions about her past. But with each passing minute, she could feel the tension in the room building like a thunderstorm about to break. Sheriff Thompson lingered longer than usual over his coffee, his weathered fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the bar top. Rose knew he was buying her time, but they both understood he couldn't stay all night. The town needed its sheriff on patrol, especially with the county fair starting tomorrow. The group in the corner had spread out, occupying 2 tables now. Their voices grew louder with each round, and their stories more outlandish. Rose caught fragments about recent bar fights in neighboring towns, about women who didn't know their place, about showing people what's what. She'd heard it all before, in 100 different bars across 3 states. As she moved between tables, Rose noticed how the other customers had positioned themselves. Old Joe had switched to water but showed no signs of leaving. 2 ranch hands who usually kept to themselves had moved their chairs to face the rowdy group. Even Betty, the middle-aged diner owner who stopped in most nights for a nightcap, had chosen to sit at the bar instead of her usual booth. These people were protecting her in their own quiet way, and it made Rose's chest tight with an unfamiliar emotion. In her old life, loyalty had been bought with money or fear. This was different, this was community, something she'd never thought she'd have again after that bloody day 5 years ago. The memory of that day surfaced again, sharper now. She remembered the young deputy she'd saved, barely more than a kid really. He'd reminded her of her younger brother, the one she'd left behind when she'd run away at 16. The deputy had been scared but trying hard not to show it, just like her brother used to do. That resemblance had made her hesitate just long enough to change the course of her life. Last call's coming up soon, the leader of the troublemakers called out, mockingly. Better make it count, boys. His group responded with the kind of laughter that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with threat. Rose caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror behind the bar. 5 years ago, she'd been known as Quick Draw Quinn, the fastest gun in a crew of professional outlaws. Now she wore a simple black shirt and jeans, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, looking every bit the small-town barmaid she'd become. The gun she'd once worn like a second skin was locked away in a safety deposit box 2 states over, along with the money she'd saved from her last legal job before settling here. Sheriff Thompson finally stood up, leaving his coffee cup empty. Mighty fine coffee as always, Rose, he said, loud enough to carry. Then, quieter, I'll be doing rounds every half hour. You've got my number. Rose nodded, knowing she wouldn't call even if things went bad. She'd learned long ago that depending on others was a luxury she couldn't afford. Besides, she had her own ways of handling trouble. As the sheriff's boots faded down the wooden sidewalk outside, the atmosphere in the bar shifted. The troublemaker's leader stood up, swaggering toward the bar with the exaggerated care of someone trying to hide how drunk they are. "Sugar," he said, planting both hands on the bar top, "how about you and me have a private conversation about customer service?" His friend snickered, spreading out around the bar in a way that made Rose's combat-trained instincts scream warnings. "I think we've had all the conversation we need," Rose replied, keeping her voice level. "In fact, I'm calling last call early tonight. Time to settle up, gentlemen." The leader's face darkened. "Now that's not very hospitable. We came all the way from Silver Creek for a good time, and we're not leaving until we get one." His hand moved to his jacket pocket, and Rose caught the distinctive outline of a knife. In her peripheral vision, she saw old Joe starting to stand, his face set in determination. Betty had her hand in her purse, probably reaching for her phone. The ranch hands were tensing, ready to move. "Don't," Rose said sharply, and everyone froze. She wasn't sure who she was talking to, her would-be defenders or the troublemakers. Maybe both. Nobody needs to do anything they'll regret. The thin man from earlier laughed, high and nervous. "Only thing I'm regretting is not getting to know you better, sweetheart." He moved closer to the bar, trying to box her in. Rose felt the familiar calm settling over her, the same clarity she used to feel before a heist. Time seemed to slow down as her mind catalogued every detail, the positions of everyone in the room, the potential weapons within reach, the multiple exit routes she'd mapped out her first day on the job. She thought about the life she'd built here, the small apartment above the laundromat where she grew herbs on the windowsill, the book club she'd joined at the library, the stray cat she fed every morning. Simple things, normal things, but they meant everything to her now. The leader's hand was definitely on a knife in his pocket. His friends were spreading out, cutting off escape routes. They thought they had her cornered, trapped behind her own bar. They thought she was just another small-town barmaid who'd be easy prey. What they didn't know was that Rose had spent years studying men like them, learning their patterns, their weaknesses. She'd survived firefights and federal manhunts, outsmarted career criminals and corrupt lawmen. She knew exactly how this situation could play out, and she knew she had to find a way to end it without anyone realizing just how dangerous she really was. As she reached for the phone under the bar, making sure they all saw her doing it, Rose allowed herself a small smile. Sometimes the best way to win a fight was to make sure it never started in the first place. And if that didn't work, well, she hadn't survived this long by being helpless. Rose kept her hand visible on the phone, watching how the leader's eyes narrowed at the sight. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd learned from years of talking her way out of tight spots. "I'm going to call the sheriff, and you boys are going to leave peacefully. No one wants trouble here." The leader leaned forward, his breath heavy with whiskey. "Maybe trouble's exactly what we want. Maybe we came looking for it." His hand was still in his pocket, gripping what Rose knew was a knife. Behind him, his friends had spread out in a pattern that was too deliberate for drunk men. These weren't just random troublemakers, Rose realized. They'd done this before. The way they moved, the way they'd waited for the sheriff to leave, the way they'd positioned themselves, this was practiced. They were hunters, and they'd chosen her bar as their hunting ground. "Last chance," Rose said, picking up the phone. "Walk away now." The leader's hand shot out, faster than a drunk man should move, knocking the phone from her grip. It clattered across the floor, sliding under a table. "Oops," he said with a cruel smile. "Butterfingers." Old Joe stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Now see here," he began, but Rose cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Joe," she said firmly, "take Betty and go home." When he started to protest, she met his eyes. "Please. I've got this handled." She did have it handled, though not in the way anyone in the bar might expect. Rose had spotted at least 3 things wrong with these men's supposedly intimidating setup. First, they'd positioned themselves to cut off the obvious exits, but had forgotten about the kitchen door. Second, they were too spread out, if it came to a fight, they'd get in each other's way. And third, they'd made the mistake of thinking she was trapped behind the bar. In her old life, the bar had been her crew's favorite place to plan heists. She'd learned early on that a bar's layout could be used to control a situation. The high ground of standing while others sat, the bottleneck created by the bar itself, the psychological advantage of being the one controlling the alcohol, she'd used it all before. "You've got nothing handled, sugar," the leader said, reaching across the bar again. This time, instead of grabbing for her, he picked up a bottle of top-shelf whiskey. "But don't worry, we'll make sure you're properly compensated for your time." He pulled out a thick wallet and started peeling off bills, tossing them onto the bar with exaggerated flicks of his wrist. The message was clear: he thought he could buy the right to do whatever he wanted. Rose watched the money land with a detached sort of amusement. 5 years ago, she'd helped steal $500,000 from a bank transport. The sight of a few crumpled 20s didn't impress her. What interested her more was how his show of wealth had made his friends shift position, their eyes following the money with naked greed. These men weren't as unified as they pretended to be. Rose had seen it countless times in her old crew, how money could turn partners into enemies in the blink of an eye. She'd learned to spot the weak links, the ones who could be turned against each other with the right pressure. "That's mighty generous of you," she said, making her voice sound impressed. She saw how it stroked his ego, made him puff up with pride. "You must be doing well for yourself up in Silver Creek." The thin man, who'd moved to her left while she was focused on the leader, suddenly looked uncomfortable. "Hey, boss, maybe we shouldn't." "Shut it," the leader snapped, but Rose had caught it. There was something there, some tension about Silver Creek that she could use. She started gathering the money off the bar, making a show of counting it slowly. "Must be, what, 300 here? That's a lot of cash to be carrying around." She paused, letting concern color her voice. "Hope you didn't run into any trouble, what with those bank robberies up north lately." The effect was immediate. The barrel-chested man by the door straightened up, his face darkening. The thin man took a step back. Even the leader's confident smile flickered for a moment. Rose kept her expression neutral, but inside she was smiling. She'd been right, these men were running from something, and whatever it was had them spooked. Maybe they'd been involved in those robberies she'd heard about on the news, or maybe they were just hiding from someone they'd crossed. Either way, they were afraid of attention. "You boys don't want the sheriff looking too closely at why you're here," she continued, her voice low and reasonable. "And I don't want any trouble in my bar. So why don't we call it a night? You take your money back, finish your drinks, and leave quietly. Nobody has to know about any of this." The leader's face had turned an ugly shade of red. His hand tightened on the bottle he was holding, and for a moment, Rose thought he might try to use it as a weapon. She subtly shifted her weight, preparing for what might come next. But before he could move, sirens wailed in the distance. Through the windows, red and blue lights began to paint the street outside. Rose hadn't called anyone. She knew those sirens were probably heading to some other late-night disturbance, but the timing was perfect. The effect on the troublemakers was electric. The thin man was already backing toward the door. The barrel-chested one looked to their leader, waiting for direction. Even the ones who'd been hanging back started moving, their practiced intimidation formation dissolving into uncertain shuffling. Rose saw the moment the leader's bravado cracked. Whatever he was running from, it was bad enough that even the possibility of police attention was too much to risk. He slammed the bottle down on the bar, hard enough that liquor sloshed out the top. "This isn't over," he growled, but they both knew it was. He snatched his money back from the bar, stuffing it into his pocket with shaking hands. Rose watched them file out, noting how their earlier swagger had vanished. She'd learned long ago that most predators turned into prey when they realized they'd picked the wrong target. These men were no different, they were bullies who'd been outmaneuvered by someone they'd underestimated, and they knew it. The sirens faded into the distance, but their effect lingered in the tense atmosphere of the bar. Rose watched through the windows as the troublemakers piled into their trucks, their earlier bravado replaced by barely contained panic. She'd seen that look before, men who thought they were predators suddenly realizing they were prey. Old Joe hadn't left despite her earlier request. He stood near his usual corner, his cane planted firmly on the floor. Betty had moved to stand beside him, her phone still clutched in her hand. The two ranch hands remained at their table, eyes fixed on the door as if expecting the men to return. "Everyone okay?" Rose asked, her voice steadied despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. A chorus of nods answered her. Good. Next round's on the house. As she poured drinks, her hands didn't shake, they never did, not even in the old days when she'd had to make split-second decisions with lives on the line. But her mind was racing, analyzing every word she'd said, every move she'd made. Had she revealed too much? Had anyone noticed how quickly she'd picked up on the tension between the men, how easily she'd exploited their fears? That was something else, Rose, Betty said, accepting a fresh glass of wine. The way you handled those thugs reminded me of my sister when she was a negotiator for the police department. You ever done that kind of work? Rose's heart skipped a beat, but her face remained carefully neutral. Just lots of experience dealing with drunk customers, she said with a light laugh. You learn to read people in this job. Old Joe shuffled to the bar, his expression troubled. Those weren't just ordinary troublemakers, he said quietly. Way they moved, way they watched everything, reminded me of my time in the service. Those boys have done bad things, mark my words. Rose busied herself wiping down the bar, buying time to choose her words carefully. Probably just small-time crooks thinking they're bigger than they are, she said. You see it all the time in this business. But she knew Joe was right. Those men had been organized, practiced, the kind of people who were used to taking what they wanted through intimidation and violence. In her past life, she'd known dozens like them. Some had even been part of her crew before everything went wrong. The memory of that final day surfaced again, the sound of sirens much like tonight's, the weight of the money bag she'd abandoned to help the wounded deputy, the look of betrayal on her crew leader's face when he'd realized she wasn't coming with them. She'd made her choice that day, turned her back on a life of violence and crime. But the skills she'd learned, the instincts she'd developed, those weren't so easy to leave behind. The door chimed, and Sheriff Thompson walked in. His timing was too perfect to be coincidence, he must have been watching from nearby. Everything quiet? He asked, though his sharp eyes were already taking in the scene. Just the usual Tuesday night, Rose replied, reaching for his coffee cup. Though those out-of-towners you were worried about decided to move on. The sheriff accepted the coffee with a knowing look. Imagine that. Wouldn't have anything to do with those sirens earlier, would it? Deputy Chen was responding to a fight at the bowling alley. Rose shrugged, the gesture carefully casual. Guess some folks just get nervous around law enforcement. The small group of regulars who'd stayed through the confrontation began to relax, falling into quiet conversations about what had happened. Rose listened with half an ear as she went about her closing routine, noting how the story was already changing in the telling. By tomorrow, it would be just another tale of how the Red Pine steady-handed barmaid had faced down some rowdy customers. But as she worked, Rose's mind was elsewhere. Those men had come from Silver Creek, and something about that place had made them jumpy. She made a mental note to check the local news, to keep an ear out for any whispers of trouble. Not because she was looking to get involved, those days were long behind her, but because trouble had a way of finding her no matter how far she ran. The clock struck midnight, and Rose began the familiar ritual of last call. Her remaining customers settled their tabs, leaving generous tips and warm words of appreciation. Old Joe was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at her. You know, he said thoughtfully, my wife used to say there are two kinds of strength in this world. There's the kind that breaks things, and the kind that knows how to keep things from breaking in the first place. You remind me of her sometimes. Rose felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with alcohol. Your wife sounds like a wise woman. That she was, Joe said with a sad smile. You take care now. And Rose? Whatever brought you to our little town? I'm glad it did. After he left, Rose stood in the quiet bar, looking at her reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. 5 years ago, she'd been someone else entirely, a woman who solved problems with a gun instead of words, who valued freedom above everything else. Now here she was, a small-town barmaid who'd found something she'd never expected, a home worth protecting. She began counting out the register, her movements precise and practiced. Tomorrow would be another day of serving drinks, wiping tables, and keeping the peace. But tonight had been a reminder that her past was never as far behind her as she might wish. The sound of engines revving drew her attention to the window. A truck was passing by, not one of the troublemaker's vehicles, just a local teenager heading home late. But Rose watched until it disappeared around the corner, her eyes automatically tracking its movement, noting details that most people would miss. Old habits died hard, especially the ones that had kept her alive. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, but Rose couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her. She sat at her small kitchen table, coffee in hand, scanning the local news websites on her laptop. The headlines from Silver Creek caught her attention immediately. Local bank reports suspicious activities, police investigate string of break-ins, business owners report escalating protection racket. Something was building up there, something that reminded her too much of how her old crew used to operate. They'd always start small, a few threats here, some vandalism there, building up to something bigger. The troublemakers from last night fit the pattern perfectly, muscle for hire, testing the waters in neighboring towns, looking for easy targets. Rose closed the laptop and rubbed her temples. She'd worked hard to build this new life, to become someone who solved problems with words instead of weapons. But as she prepared for another day at the bar, she couldn't help but remember the lessons her old crew leader had taught her about territory and power. "It's never about the first move," he'd said, teaching her to play chess in a safe house while they waited for a job. "It's about seeing 3 moves ahead, about knowing where every piece on the board is going before they do." The Red Pine Tavern was quiet when she arrived, sunlight streaming through windows she'd cleaned just yesterday. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, but somehow the familiar space felt different now. Those men had changed something just by walking through her door. They'd brought a piece of her old world into this sanctuary she'd built. As she went through her opening routine, Rose's mind drifted back to the day she'd first arrived in town. She'd been running then, though not from the law. After helping that deputy and walking away from the crew's biggest score, she'd known it was only a matter of time before someone came looking for answers, or revenge. She'd chosen this town carefully, using skills she'd learned planning heists to find a place that was just right, small enough to be overlooked, but busy enough that a newcomer wouldn't draw too much attention. The Red Pine had been up for sale, its owner retiring after 30 years. Rose had used her savings, all legally earned from her time working as a security consultant after leaving the crew, to buy the place. The bell above the door chimed, startling her from her thoughts. Betty walked in, carrying a covered dish that steamed in the morning air. "Brought you some breakfast," Betty said, setting the dish on the bar. "Figured you might need it after last night. Made my special biscuits and gravy." Rose felt that now familiar warmth in her chest. "You didn't have to do that." "Course I did. That's what neighbors do." Betty settled onto a bar stool, her expression turning serious. "Listen, Rose, about last night. Sheriff Thompson asked me to keep an eye out for those men. Said they might be connected to some trouble up in Silver Creek." Rose kept her face carefully neutral as she poured Betty a coffee. "Trouble seems to follow some people." "That it does," Betty agreed, stirring sugar into her cup. "Reminds me of when I first moved here, running from my ex-husband. Thought I'd have to keep running forever, always looking over my shoulder. But this town, it has a way of taking in strays, giving them a home." The parallel wasn't lost on Rose. She'd noticed how the townspeople had gradually accepted her over the past 5 years, never pushing for details about her past but offering support in their own quiet ways. Old Joe bringing her fresh vegetables from his garden, Betty sharing recipes and gossip, the sheriff stopping by regularly to make sure she was okay. The morning passed quietly, but Rose found herself paying extra attention to every customer who walked through the door. She noted how they moved, where they looked first, what they carried, all the little details that had once helped her spot undercover cops or rival crew members. Around noon, Sheriff Thompson came in for his usual coffee. He settled onto his regular stool, but there was tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there yesterday. "Got some interesting news from my contact in Silver Creek," he said quietly, after Rose had served him. "Those men last night? They work for someone called the Ghost." Rose's hand froze for just a moment as she wiped the bar. The Ghost was a name she hadn't heard in years, not since her crew had crossed paths with his operation in Arizona. He'd been small-time then, but ambitious, the kind of criminal who built power through fear and never forgot a slight. "Sounds like a comic book villain," she said lightly, but her mind was racing. If the Ghost was operating in Silver Creek, and his men had found their way to her bar, it couldn't be a coincidence. Had he recognized her? Had he sent those men to test her, to confirm his suspicions? "Maybe so," Thompson replied, "but he's causing real trouble. Started with small businesses, demanding protection money. Now there's talk of bigger plans. Banks getting nervous, people selling their shops and moving away." Rose thought about her bar, about the community she'd built here. She thought about Betty and old Joe, about the ranch hands who'd been ready to fight for her last night, about all the people who'd taken her in without questioning her past. In her old life, she would have already been planning her escape, picking out a new town and a new identity. But something had changed in the past 5 years. She'd put down roots here, become part of something larger than herself. The sheriff must have read something in her expression, because he leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "Listen, Rose, I don't know what brought you to our town, and I don't need to know. But whatever it is, whatever you're running from, you're not alone anymore." The words hit her hard, reminding her of something her brother had said the last time she'd seen him, before she'd run away and fallen in with the wrong crowd. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing and fighting, it's letting other people stand with you." As the lunch crowd began to filter in, Rose found herself watching the door with new eyes. 5 years ago, she'd chosen this town as a hiding place. Now it was home, and she was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, it was worth fighting for, not with guns and violence like in her past, but with the strength that came from being part of a community. That evening, the Red Pine Tavern was busier than usual. Word had spread about the previous night's confrontation, drawing curious locals who wanted to see the place where their quiet barmaid had faced down 7 troublemakers. Rose noticed how they studied her when they thought she wasn't looking, their expressions a mix of curiosity and admiration. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, serving drinks and making small talk while her mind worked through the implications of what Sheriff Thompson had told her. The Ghost's appearance in Silver Creek wasn't random. He'd always had a talent for finding weak points, places where fear could take root and grow into control. As she worked, Rose found herself recalling more details about him from her old life. The Ghost had earned his nickname not just because he was hard to find, but because he had a way of haunting places long before he actually showed up. He'd send his men ahead, like test waves before a storm, watching how communities reacted. The bell above the door chimed, and Rose looked up to see 2 unfamiliar faces enter the bar. They weren't the men from last night, but something about the way they moved, careful, measured steps, eyes scanning the room, made her instincts prickle. They were too controlled to be casual customers, too aware of their surroundings. Old Joe, sitting at his usual spot, noticed them too. His hand tightened on his cane as they approached the bar, but Rose gave him a subtle shake of her head. If these men were connected to the Ghost, any sign of hostility would only confirm that this town was worth targeting. "Evening," Rose said as they reached the bar. "What can I get you?" The taller one smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just passing through, heard this was the place to stop for a drink." His accent wasn't local, it had a hint of Texas that Rose recognized from her time running jobs along the border. "That's right," she replied, keeping her voice friendly but neutral. We serve anyone who's willing to mind their manners. The shorter one chuckled, but there was an edge to it. Heard you had some trouble with manners last night. Some boys from up north getting rowdy. And there it was, the real reason for their visit. They were scouts, sent to gauge the situation after last night's failed intimidation attempt. Rose had played this game before, back when her crew would case potential targets. The key was to appear unremarkable while gathering information. Nothing serious, she said with a casual shrug. Just some drunk folks who needed reminding about our house rules. Happens in any bar. The tall one nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. Sure does. Shame about what's happening up in Silver Creek, though. Lots of businesses having trouble with their house rules. Rose felt a familiar tension building in her shoulders, the kind she used to get before a job went bad. These men weren't just scouts, they were messengers. The ghost was letting her know that he remembered her, that he knew exactly who was running this small-town bar. But as she looked around the room, she saw something the ghost and his men couldn't understand. Every regular in the place was watching, ready to act if needed. Betty had her phone out under the table, probably already texting the sheriff. The ranch hands from last night had positioned themselves near the door, pretending to be absorbed in their drinks. This wasn't just her bar anymore, it was a part of the community. And unlike the frightened businesses in Silver Creek, the Red Pine had something the ghost couldn't easily break: unity. Well, Rose said, pulling 2 glasses from under the bar, while you're here, why don't you try our house special? On the house. She poured 2 fingers of top-shelf whiskey into each glass, noting how the shorter man's eyebrows rose at the gesture. It was a calculated move, one she'd learned from her old crew leader. Sometimes the best way to handle a threat was to subvert expectations, to show strength through generosity rather than fear or aggression. Mighty kind of you, the tall one said, raising his glass in a mock toast. To house rules. To community, Rose corrected him, holding his gaze. It was a subtle challenge, a message of her own. This place wasn't just a business to be intimidated or a territory to be claimed. They drank in silence, but Rose could see them reassessing the situation. They'd come expecting to find a lone woman running a vulnerable bar, maybe even hoping to recognize the former outlaw known as Quick Draw Quinn. Instead, they'd found something else, a community fixture protected by the very people the ghost hoped to terrorize. As they set their empty glasses down, the shorter one reached for his wallet, but Rose waved him off. Like I said, on the house. You boys have a safe trip back. The implied message wasn't lost on them, she knew where they were heading, and she wasn't afraid to let them know she knew. The tall one's face tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his false smile. Appreciate the hospitality, he said, turning to leave. At the door, he paused. You know, my boss is always looking for good business people to work with. Especially ones who understand how things work. Rose wiped down the bar, her movements unhurried. I understand exactly how things work, she replied, letting just a hint of her old self surface in her voice. That's why I'm not interested in changing anything here. After they left, the tension in the room gradually eased. Conversations resumed, though Rose noticed they were quieter than before. Old Joe made his way to the bar, his expression concerned. Those fellas, he said softly, they weren't just passing through, were they? Rose thought about lying, about protecting these people from the reality of what might be coming. But they deserved better than that. They'd stood by her, trusted her, made her one of their own. No, she admitted, they weren't. But whatever they're planning, whatever they think they can do here, they don't understand what they're up against. She wasn't talking about herself, though 5 years ago she would have been. She was talking about this community, about the strength that came from people looking out for each other. The ghost might have power built on fear, but fear couldn't stand against the kind of bonds she'd found here. Later that night, after the last customer had left and the chairs were turned up on tables, Rose sat in the quiet bar with Sheriff Thompson. She'd called him after the scouts left, knowing it was time to make a decision that would affect not just her, but the entire town. "The ghost," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "he's not going to stop with Silver Creek. Those men tonight, they were measuring us up, seeing if we're worth the trouble." Thompson nodded, his weathered face thoughtful. "You know something about him, don't you? Something from before you came here?" Rose looked at her reflection in the mirror behind the bar, seeing shadows of her former self. "I know his type. He builds power by making people feel alone, helpless. He isolates them, turns neighbor against neighbor, until everyone's too scared to stand together. And you think that's what he's trying here?" "I know it is." Rose stood, pacing behind the bar. "Those men last night, they weren't just random troublemakers. They were a test. And tonight's visitors? They were offering me a choice, join them or become their enemy." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You've dealt with something like this before." It wasn't a question, but Rose answered anyway. "In another life. I used to. I wasn't always on the right side of the law. But I learned some things about how operations like this work. The ghost, he's patient. He'll keep sending people, keep pushing, looking for cracks to exploit." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, studying her. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "Rose, I've known since you first came to town that you were running from something. Didn't know what, didn't need to know. What mattered was who you chose to become here." The words touched something deep in Rose's heart. 5 years ago, she'd been someone else entirely, a woman who solved problems with violence, who trusted no one but herself. Now she was part of something bigger, something worth protecting. "I could leave," she said softly. "Draw his attention away from the town. He's probably more interested in me than the place anyway." "You could," Thompson agreed. "But is that what you want?" Rose thought about Betty's morning visits with fresh biscuits, about old Joe's garden vegetables and quiet wisdom, about all the regular customers who'd become more like family than patrons. She thought about the deputy she'd saved 5 years ago, how that one act of choosing right over easy had led her here. "No," she said finally. "It's not what I want. But staying means bringing trouble to your town." Thompson laughed, a warm, genuine sound that filled the empty bar. "Our town, Rose. And trouble? This place has handled plenty of that before you came along. Remember the flood 2 years ago? Everyone said the downtown businesses would never recover. But we all pitched in, helped each other rebuild. That's what community means." Rose smiled, remembering how the whole town had worked together during those difficult weeks. She'd seen more strength in those days than in any of her old crew's supposedly tough members. "So what's your suggestion, Sheriff?" "Well," he said, standing up, "I reckon it's time we showed the ghost why small towns aren't the easy targets he thinks they are. I'll make some calls, talk to the Silver Creek authorities. Maybe it's time they had some help dealing with their problem." "And the Red Pine?" "Business as usual," Thompson said firmly. "But maybe we organize some community events here. Weekly gatherings, fundraisers for the local school. Show everyone that this place isn't just a bar, it's a cornerstone of the community." Rose understood what he was suggesting. The ghost's power came from isolation, from making people feel alone and afraid. The best defense wasn't guns or violence, it was unity, the kind of strength that came from people standing together. "I know some things," she said carefully, "about how operations like his work. Ways they move money, people they work with. All strictly legal information, of course." Thompson's eyes twinkled. "Of course. And I'm sure the FBI task force that's been quietly investigating activities in Silver Creek would find such information very interesting. Purely as background for their ongoing investigation, naturally." Rose felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For 5 years, she'd kept her past locked away, afraid that acknowledging it would somehow taint the new life she'd built. But maybe her experiences, even the darker ones, could serve a purpose here. The next morning, Rose opened the Red Pine as usual. But as she wiped down the bar and set out the chairs, she noticed small changes. Betty arrived earlier than usual, bringing not just breakfast but flyers for a community potluck she wanted to host at the bar. Old Joe came in with a group of veterans, talking about making the Red Pine their regular meeting spot. Throughout the day, more townspeople stopped by, each with their own ideas for making the bar more than just a place to drink. Rose listened to their suggestions, feeling a profound sense of belonging she'd never known in her old life. By evening, word had spread about the ghosts' activities in Silver Creek. But instead of fear, Rose saw determination in her customers' faces. They weren't just patrons anymore, they were partners in protecting something valuable. As she served drinks and chatted with regulars, Rose kept one eye on the door, knowing the ghost would send more people, make more threats. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't planning an escape route. She was planning to stand her ground, not with violence or intimidation, but with the strength of a community united. The sun set on another day at the Red Pine Tavern, its warm light filtering through windows that had seen decades of town history. Rose stood behind her bar, looking at the faces of people who had become family, and knew she'd finally found something her old crew had never understood, a home worth fighting for, and the right way to fight for it.